Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be in the world. We're here to celebrate the publication of our new book, A Vision for Europe 2020, Nothing But an Alternative, because as the world spins faster and faster on its axis, it does indeed appear impossible to sustain what was a visibly unsustainable status quo. I'm joined tonight by two incredible guests. I feel very lucky to be in their presence. The first is Yanis Varoufakis, a member of the Hellenic Parliament and the co-founder of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025. He also happens to be the author of the introduction to this book, A Vision for Europe, out today, which lays out a sort of masterful analysis of where we are and where Europe might be heading in the year ahead, something that we'll discuss in the course of this presentation. So Yanis, please welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David.
And our second guest tonight is Shoshana Zuboff. Shoshana is the Charles Edward Wilson Professor Emerita at Harvard Business School and a former faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School. Shoshana joins us now from Maine. Hi, Shoshana.
Hello, David. Hello, Yanis. I'm so pleased to be here with both of you.
Yes, what a joy.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So we're here. Also, I should have mentioned Shoshana is a contributor to our new volume, speaking a bit about her recent book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Again, another theme that we'll get into today. I thought we could just jump right in and maybe give our listeners, our viewers, a sense of why exactly we're here. We've come out with this book, A Vision for Europe. It's a rather anodyne title. We could have done a lot more offensive, controversial, and otherwise interesting titles. So I thought we'd break it down a bit. Let's think about the first component of this, a vision. I think it's a very interesting thing to talk about what a vision means at this particular moment, right? Crises can both collapse imagination as everyone goes into the detailed minutiae of how to manage the day-to-day existence of the communities where they live. It can also expand the boundaries of the imagination at the same time, expand the realm of the possible. So my first question is, why is it necessary to put forward a vision at this critical juncture in history? And if we're talking about putting a vision of our own forward, which is the vision that we think is presently driving us through the pandemic? In all of this madness, it's difficult to tell what exactly is the dominant thinking, the dominant vision that is making decisions. Because while we're all panicking about face masks and where to isolate, someone is in fact making a vision. And what is that vision? So maybe we'll start with you, Yanni. Tell us a bit about, what does it mean to have a vision at this juncture, and what are we up against?
Well, without a vision, what is going to happen is the path of least resistance is going to be towed and followed, which means that the same oligarchy that has been running the show for a very long time, especially after the 2008 near death of financialized capitalism, will continue to do the same thing, which is socialism for the very few, and on the one hand austerity and unfettered markets, and on the other surveillance capitalism for the many. So a vision is a necessary but certainly not a sufficient condition in order to apply the brakes, to stop them from ruling the roost the way they have been ruling it for decades now, especially after 2008.
Yeah, something that we talk about is how the paradox of crises is they're both too short and too long. They're too long in the obvious sense that we don't want crises to last forever, but they're too short in that if you blink or you don't, then it's rewritten the rules and you have to write them. So, with a book like this that's kind of sweeping and comprehensive, what do you think is, what are the stakes of putting forward a vision against, this unfettered or well?
I see you're competing with Antonio and Gramsci. He talked about, the new that is refusing to be born once the old has died. And what you're doing is you are juxtaposing the crisis that is simultaneously too short and too long. Look, this crisis has been far too long. It started, let's say, in 1971, maybe earlier. It started with the end of the post-war Bretton Woods period. That was a very unique example of planned capitalism at the global level. But that plan just went to pieces the moment the United States turned from a surplus to a deficit country, and to maintain its hegemony, what happened was, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar was used in order to create financialization, to create a very mad and imbalanced equilibrium, which collapsed in 2008. And ever since, central banks and governments have been reflating the financiers at the expense of everyone else. So it's a hugely long crisis. COVID-19 is simply accelerating it. This is not a new crisis, at least not in my book or mind. And with the technological gadgets that are being invented, capitalism is simultaneously undermining itself and undermining civilization's capacity to find a substitute for capitalism.
So I think it's this typically sweeping view of the last half century as being a period of prolonged and compounding crisis. But if I can turn to you now, Shoshana, I mean, you're here. You are in Maine with perhaps a different view of the stakes of the vision that's being put forward, and I think it's also an interesting idea of vision because it implies, the looking glass. I mean, what does it mean to have, putting forward a vision, because whose vision is really dominant now in the course of this crisis?
Well, so I'm going to take a bit of a different approach. For me, it's always about trying to sense what's emerging in people and in the felt experience of people. So this takes me in a slightly different direction. So I think the first thing, and of course I recognize what Yanni is saying, a crisis that began, I like to date it from 1975 when they published The Crisis of Democracy, which has been the playbook for all these decades. But the current crisis is real. And here's what I think is so distinctive about it. People all over the world are we're living our everyday lives with something very deeply in common. And that is that everyday life is now being experienced at the interface of two huge uncertainties, one macro, one micro. So on the one hand, our lives are constrained by the still largely unknown biology of a microorganism whose name we didn't even know just a few months ago. And that has now come into, our homes and our sense of our bodies, and that's one wall of our existence right now. And on the other side is another great uncertainty, but now at the macro level, and that is the quality of our political institutions. Because the pandemic is not the pandemic is not the pandemic. It's a completely different experience depending upon where you live and what kind of political institution has governance authority where you live. So the pandemic in Costa Rica is completely different from the pandemic in Brazil. The pandemic in the United States is completely different from the pandemic in New Zealand, as I think everybody now recognizes. So this strange interface that we're living at, to me, has had a very positive impact in a crazy kind of way, in a dialectical kind of way. And it is bringing to life, I think, or accelerating something that had already started to be felt, but that feeling has now been intensified and amplified. I certainly see it in America, but I think we're seeing it around the world in many different manifestations. And that is a realization that society is a reality, that society is the necessary ambience in which we live and breathe, that our lives depend upon the quality of our society. And as Yanni has written about, and many of us are well aware, these have been 5 decades of trying to extinguish the idea of society, extinguish the public sphere, extinguish the sense of how everything that defines us as individuals, every concept of human rights, every concept of human freedom depends upon, is the effect of a cause, and the cause is social trust, social solidarity, and in the end, the quality of our society and our social systems. So I feel that, so at the beginning of the pandemic, surveillance capitalism exploding, other forms of surveillance being introduced by the state, and everything I'm reading is about a foregone conclusion of a dystopic future. Biosurveillance, dystopia in all of its forms, very, very grim, very deterministic. I didn't believe it then, I argued against it then, and I feel even more strongly now that we are moving through this dialectic and that there is a vision that is emergent. And it is not yet, and I agree with Yanni, it is not at this point a true comprehensive, detailed vision of an alternative to capitalism. But it is a vision of a sense of social solidarity as being necessary to the well-being of every individual, of our families, of our neighborhoods, of our communities, and so forth. Very felt realization that we have lacked. It's been there, among progressives and so on, but it has not been more of a population shared experience. And I think that's what's happening now. And as a result, we're seeing in America rather quickly a shift to themes of resistance, a shift to themes of creative resistance, and the sense that that this is the time to rethink the social contract, that we're not going forward with normal, that we have to counter inequality, that we have to counter racism, that we have to counter the surveillance society, because without that, we can't possibly achieve the kind of society we need for those rights and freedoms that we hold so high. So I'm feeling very bullish, if you will, very optimistic about these threads emerging that become the basis for a new vision moving forward, and I'm very excited about that.
We may have lost David.
No.
Did I put you to sleep, or
no,
are you lost in contemplation?
I was lost in your optimism. I was recovering the spirit to come back. No, I mean, I think it's to bring it back to the sense of what it means to put a vision forward. I mean, whether or not you take, I guess, my more pessimistic spin on the fact that there needs to be a confrontation with the people who are making these decisions and in the mess and the rumble are making them without enough public scrutiny, or you take your more optimistic vision about the realm of possibility opening up. I think it's an important time to be putting forward a bold program. Now, I want to turn to the second half of this title, which is a vision for Europe, which is that Shoshana, you put forward, I think you're exactly right that it's not just vision, it's visions, right? The pandemic, which only very briefly existed as a planetary reality before it quickly became a highly uneven topography, right? Here in Italy, it was one reality, one calm. First it was mad, no, now it's placid, just as the pandemic begins to rage through the global south. And I'm curious to know, Yanis, at this moment where Europe appears to have succeeded through, whether hook or crook, soft power, hard power, whatever mechanisms, at recovering its image of competence. There's a great poll that came out that basically the world thinks that Germany was one of the best responses out there, despite the fact that it pales in comparison to the Taiwanese, the South Koreans, the Vietnamese, etc. Right? So Europe as this bastion of kind of soft power competence. I mean, where do you think we're at? If you set the stakes of the vision, what does it mean to have a vision for Europe at this moment where things appear to be returning to normal on the continent and elsewhere appear to be escalating in their severity?
Well, firstly, let me just say, David, that I agree with almost everything Shoshana said, actually everything Shoshana said, but of course I would put it in my own narrative terms, the same story. Shoshana, I choose to be deeply pessimistic while enthusiastically hopeful.
I understand.
I don't, and this is a political choice. It's not.
I understand. I understand completely.
Also, one small variation on the theme that both you and David put forward: the manifestation of a crisis is always varied and diverse. Whether climate change, say climate change, you can have bushfires in Siberia and flooding in North Queensland. Very different phenomena, very different manifestations, but it's a single crisis. There is one cause, and the cause that we are facing is forget that silly bit of RNA, not even DNA, that is pausing capitalism and putting capitalism on hold. What we have is just a bankrupt economic system worldwide, whose deep-seated crisis that started a long time ago is morphing in different ways and has different manifestations in different places. But let me go now straight to David's question about Germany. Shoshana, you're completely right that it took the lockdown for people to be reminded of the importance of solidarity and community and society, and that there is such a thing as society. Even Boris Johnson came out in the midst of this crisis and admitted, in order to perhaps to distinguish himself from Margaret Thatcher, that there is such a thing as society, even though I think that Margaret Thatcher is intellectually superior to Boris Johnson, but that's my tragedy. I disagree with her more fiercely, but she is more coherent from a political philosophy point of view. I think the most important thing beyond solidarity, because even right-wingers understand community. If you go to Trump land, there is a sense of community amongst the people who support Donald Trump. But what I think was the genuine revelation for most people, including for myself, something I knew, at the back of my head, but I needed this to be demonstrated yet again, to be reminded of its significance, is the question of the power of government. Because, we all suffered the last 30 years of neoliberalism, where we were being told that markets rule the world, and politicians and governments are either incompetent or corrupt or utterly disempowered. And suddenly we realized that governments have enormous power. They can, lock us in. They can shift mountain ranges of dollars and yen and pounds. The very same politicians that admonished anyone who dared speak of, £1 million being spent on the National Health Service. We were reminded of what Lenin so succinctly put, that politics is all about who does what to whom, and that government and politics allow some people to tell the rest what to do. And if this is a very revolutionary thought, because if that is the case, then, the demos can take over power and create democracy, something we don't have, because all we've had for years now is oligarchy with elections, with occasional elections run by the oligarchy. So, and back finally to Germany. Germany is a country that has traditionally understood and practiced brilliantly the art of power, the art of organization, from anything from a supply chain leading to a Volkswagen car to how the system should work, the bureaucracy should work. Germany has always been fantastic at that. What they're chronically bad at is to understand how capitalism works. So the economic policies that will flow from Berlin across Europe will be devastating for the majorities of people, including in Germany, because of the combination of austerity for the many and socialism for the few that they are going to be peddling.
I mean, I'm fascinated by this question of best practice. I mean, we have these, let's say, isomorphic models of pandemic preparedness and what it takes and what it doesn't. And my sense is we run a real risk as Germany presents itself as this heroic model that they say, for example, we were Austerians, but now you can see why. You can see why because our fiscal flexibility, let's say our piggy bank was big enough for us to be able to spend on our pandemic response. And that's why we're so successful, right?
Yeah.
And so the stakes are incredibly high in terms of which vision of Europe is put forward and how it's put forward and which success stories are being told. I mean, in a way, Shoshana, and I'm curious for your view of this, the U.S. didn't ever stand a chance of presenting itself to the world as a success story, right? The game was lost before it started with this crop of idiots in power. So, I'm turning the question back to you, Shoshana. What do we think in terms of this question of best practices? What are whether it's the tools of surveillance power, whether it's technologies that have become dominant? I'm concerned that what you put forward as a kind of things are melting away, things also might be hardening. The logic of austerity, far from disappearing, might actually be reified by the experience of a crisis that suggests, oh yeah, no, we made those Greeks suffer, but now of course you can see why. Make it work for ourselves in the context of this pandemic. So, what do you see as emerging from the course of this crisis?
Yeah, I don't see that hardening at this point as the big story. I mean, look, we're going to have this. Yanni and I are going to have this difference all the way through. I'm much more of a glass half full kind of analysis. I think you read the long arc of history, and there is always more cause for optimism than despair overall. Nothing's ever perfect. And I think, in the United States, in the UK, and even in China, which for some reason, people turn to as some kind of model of efficiency. We've had the quintessential Orwellian response, which is the denial of reality. Far more important than surveillance per se, the denial of reality, looking at facts and just absolutely denying them. And Orwell argued that what destroys a democracy most quickly is this denial of reality, because it sows so much confusion and it separates people from their own experience, and it's impossible to carry on any kind of democracy in that context. That's the kind of conflict we're embroiled in now, certainly in the US. So from this vantage point, I look at Europe and I see a glass half full. A different picture. And, I very much appreciate the Yanni's analysis. At the same time, when I look at the current leadership of the European Commission, Vestager, with whom I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, for example, these are people who I believe are among the very few on Earth right now who are willing to talk publicly about how we reinvent and invent new institutional forms that are going to be relevant to this century, that are relevant to the challenges of inclusiveness and equality, and relevant to the challenges of capitalism, including surveillance capitalism, which is another vector of power here that we haven't talked about yet. So to me, there is, speaking not as a European, but as an American, looking somewhat longingly across the ocean, not because of the rhetoric, but because I see potential there in institutions and in leaders that offer us a bridge to a future. There have to be alliances across different sets of objectives, and one has to take a long view. I know Yanis said this crisis has been going on for a while. True, but the forces of Hayek's dreamscape and operationally the forces of shareholder value have been unchallenged, have been hegemonic for these past decades. And it's only recently that we see systematic as well as systemic challenge. And so this current immediate crisis, to me, is accelerating that, and that there are alliances and things to be worked with here that will allow us to move forward into a space that we can all feel more fully represent what we mean by democracy.
Wow. Well, I didn't expect to be adjudicating a debate between a raw optimism and a raw pessimism, although I will grant you that there's a lot of optimism of will in this conversation. But Shoshana, it strikes me as interesting because if we can turn now to the concept that you mentioned, that of surveillance capitalism, doesn't seem to be faring so well in terms of the glass. The glass appears to be getting emptier by the minute, insofar as both the surveillance aspect of this seems, if we're just doing direction of travel, both the surveillance aspect of this, new technologies that are, for example, many of our viewers will be familiar with the novelty of Zoom-based, tracking that's sort of tightening the bolts of labor market exploitation as to one side, the surveillance side of things. And of course, the capitalism side of things, which is also not looking particularly hot, where, this crisis has, if 2008 at least had the mirage of boats falling together before at least some of them began to rise again, now we've got a near perfect demonstration of a thesis of immiseration of masses of people and just plain accumulation of the Jeff Bezoses of the world, of the BlackRocks of the world, et cetera. So, turning back towards you, Yanis, I mean, if we take seriously Shoshana's notion of surveillance capitalism as a real threat, how do you see these two pieces combining? There's a surveillance element, there's a capitalism element, and of course there's the sort of conceptual framing that Shoshana's put forward in terms of where we might be heading. But maybe as well, the point about sort of how things do look from Southern Europe and Greece in particular.
Well, I'm the last person to try to pierce the bubble of excitement of my comrades and friends in the United States. I'm not just talking about you, Shoshana, I'm talking about all of my American friends who completely understandably look at Europe from your side of the pond as a kind of utopia, and which, of course, you would, given that you live in Trumpland.
Not utopia, but potential.
But you know what I mean. No, but believe you me, Mrs. Vestager that you mentioned has no power. She's just a front woman, while the real power resides in truly despicable, dystopic institutions that treat her, not just the people of Europe, with contempt. But look, let's go to surveillance capitalism. I think that there is this combination of the current dynamic. On the one hand, the gigantic production of public monies produced by the Federal Reserve and the other central banks, floating or refloating the corporate sector, in conjunction with the fact that this crisis has created enormous rents for the monopolistic big tech platforms. This is one force which is shaping history as we speak. The other force, of course, is fear. And the fact that digital applications can offer an opportunity to ameliorate fear. So assume just for a moment, for argument's sakes, that there was a bracelet that we could all wear connected to an app on our phone, which measured our blood pressure, our temperature, did all sorts of different kinds of analysis, and alerted us to the presence of the virus in our vicinity, in other people. And just for a moment, imagine that was possible. I think it would be absolutely impossible politically to stop it, because there would be a groundswell of demand against all those of us who worry about privacy, about Orwellian developments and so on, for this kind of technology to be utilized. And of course, any device that measures your blood pressure in response to the presence of a bit of RNA in your blood can also measure it in response to how you react when you listen to the news, to the great leader's speech, and so on and so forth. So there are three forces at work: the fear created by the pandemic, the strengthening of digital over analog, and the huge quantities of money pumped into the financial markets, going straight to the Facebooks and the Amazons and the Googles of the world.
Shoshana, what do you make of this tripartite analysis? Do we think that I'm curious to know, where you would place us now, and in terms of the development, this great historic book that you put out not so recently. Does it feel pre-pandemic in some way? Does it feel like the pandemic has altered the fabric of the concept itself? And how do you feel that the economy of surveillance capitalism is transforming along the lines that Yanis was tracing out?
Years ago, there used to be this news hour, the McNeil-Lehrer news hour, and they would always have somebody from like one side of and somebody else from the other side of the argument, and they would talk. So again, I'm going to offer a different perspective. So let's start with surveillance before we get to surveillance capitalism. And let me propose that in a modern society, there are legitimate needs for data, legitimate needs for data gathering, legitimate needs for data integration, legitimate needs, and I would put in that grouping, for example, public health. Public health has been a profession or professionalizing for the last couple of centuries. Certainly all through the 20th century, epidemiologists talk about their surveillance systems intended in a far more benign way than anything we think about today. But if you're going to track a microorganism through a population, you need data, you need to integrate it, you need to see the big picture. That's supposed to happen under the rule of law, under the governance of democratic institutions. And when it can happen that way, that's legitimate. What's happened in the past 2 decades is an explosion of illegitimate surveillance. And this has happened in the public sphere, bulk collection, warrantless surveillance, the militarization of the web. This has happened in the private sphere, surveillance capitalism, which for anybody who's not familiar with what I mean by surveillance capitalism, I try to do a one-sentence description. Surveillance capitalism is not the same as digital technology. It's an economic logic, and it is based on the illegitimate taking, which is to say the theft, the stealing of private human experience, which is repurposed as a zero-cost asset, free raw material that is shunted toward new processes of production and sales. Computational production, the products are computational products, predictions of human behavior, which are sold into a new kind of marketplace that trades exclusively in human futures, predictions of what people, groups, populations, and individuals will do. So because the tech empires like Google and Facebook, Microsoft followed, Amazon followed. Apple is in a somewhat more ambiguous space. Nonetheless, these information empires, certainly beginning with Google and Facebook, and increasingly Amazon, these $1 trillion or near $1 trillion market capitalizations are driven by this original sin of theft. So where did this come from? So as Yanis foreshadowed, this came from fear. These 2 decades of illegitimate surveillance came from fear. In this case, the so-called war on terror. The war on terror precipitated within Washington this idea that it had to be certainty at all costs. There were serious proposals for comprehensive federal privacy legislation on September 10th, and by the end of September 11th, it was all about total information awareness, and that's the trajectory that we've been on ever since. Because of that need to quell fear with certainty, this kind of fantasy of total certainty, these fledgling tech companies who were very much in the crosshairs of new regulatory paradigms suddenly became recast as heroic possibilities. And the idea was to nurture them and allow them to flourish, because they were going to invent the surveillance capabilities that existed outside of the United States Constitution, and therefore could flourish at will. And then all of this human-generated information would be there for the state to avail itself of as and when it needed it. So this is what has brought us to 2 decades in surveillance capitalism becoming a new vector of capitalism. And we see the convergence between public and private now really inscribing our lives. The idea that law enforcement, whether it's the police in Los Angeles or military divisions imprisoning the Uyghur in Xinjiang, that these entities are relying on tools that have come from the surveillance capitalist empires, facial recognition systems that are at the same time constructed with the family photos that we've posted in social media and all over the web. Okay, so here we are. So it looks like the pandemic has done a couple of things, for sure. One is it has very quickly allowed surveillance capitalism to expand its already existing lines of business. Education being an obvious one, the Zoom, the professional applications, team meetings and all of that. All of this has expanded exponentially. So now there are billions of people instead of millions of people, tens of millions of people. There are billions of people who are in these systems. But there's something else that has happened with this, and here again I'm coming back to this sense of dialectic, because as these systems have become more invasive, this is not a repetition of 2001. We are no longer, under this illusion that, gee, these are these fledgling little startups and they're run by heroes and these are geniuses and they're going to take us into the digital century. That illusion is over. So even at the very beginning of this, in the United States, where all of this is very fertile, there has been a very critical conversation that quickly expanded outside of the specialist listservs and became, first of all, a conversation about Zoom. So much so that we ended up with the US Senate telling senators that they can't use Zoom for professional business. We ended up with Google, the arch surveillance capitalist, telling its employees that it can't use Zoom for company business. All right. This is how that conversation went. The conversation about education has followed that, and many other of these applications. So now there is a very critical conversation, not just from specialists, but from people in their neighborhoods, in their families, in their kitchens, really worried about this stuff. I live in Maine. My neighbors talk to me about this all of the time. So for me, what this means, cutting to the chase here, is that this vast expansion, far from meaning that we are doomed. You know, I always think it's dangerous to predict the future as a straight line from the present. Far from meaning that we are doomed, what it has done, again, is created a more of a shared, global, amplified, accelerated realization of the following: that here we are entering the third decade of the digital century without the charters of rights, the legislative frameworks, the regulatory paradigms, and the very basic institutional forms that we require to assure ourselves that the digital future will also be a democratic future, that the digital future is compatible with democracy. And what that means is putting in very stark relief the fact that we can either be a surveillance society or we can be a democracy, but we cannot be both. And this conflict, I think, has come to a pointed, the pointed head of the arrow on this issue of public health. Because where public health should be a legitimate form of data gathering and analysis and shared understanding for the benefit of the collective, we've had so many people react against the idea of public health gathering data because the surveillance society has forfeited the solidarity and the social trust that is required for us to believe in our public health institutions. There are exceptions to this, and they're important. But in many cases, this has become a huge problem. So again, this is where I think we are accelerating right into the spaces that I predicted and hoped for in my work, of new forms of collective action leading to fundamentally institutional change, law and rights.
So, you know, I there's a great book that your speech was reminding me of, T.H. Marshall's 1950 book on citizenship and social class. And there he's also talking about the expansion of the citizenship frontier, right? The whole thesis of that book is that in the 18th century, we had civil citizenship, 19th century, political citizenship, and the 20th century, we had social citizenship, the rights to health, to housing, to water. But the core thesis of that book was that the route to the acquisition of social citizenship was through class conflict, that it was only by making, that class and citizenship were in a death battle. There was a clash between them, and it was only by allowing this notion of citizenship and rights to triumph over those market mechanisms that we were able to actually push the frontier of citizenship to acquire those new rights. So, Yanis, turning to you now, because I think Shoshana did a really nice job of splitting surveillance and capitalism and then marrying them again to think about how we might push that frontier out and where the pandemic might be leading us. I want to ask a somewhat controversial question. Do you think it's possible for us to talk about the acquisition of new rights in this third decade of the digital century without having a more serious conversation, perhaps reconsideration, perhaps revolt against this question of capitalism and class conflict? I mean, how do you take to be the relationship between these two component parts, surveillance on the one hand and capitalism on the other?
Well, I also think that it's impossible to marry surveillance capitalism with democracy, but that's not very strange because I don't think you can marry capitalism with democracy. I've argued about it for a very, very long time. And in a sense, technologies are always transformative and open new chapters. But the beauty and horrors of capitalism is, as Shoshana said, that it's not a linear historical trajectory. Karl Marx was the first to describe, in the most epic terms, the simultaneous liberation that the technologies conjured up by the capitalist dynamic bring to bear upon humanity, and at the same time, the new forms of depravity and unfreedom that comes out of exactly the same production line. I listened very carefully to Shoshana's definition of surveillance capitalism, and of course it's completely correct. But I fear that, Shoshana, that's a bit incomplete in the sense that, yes, of course, surveillance capitalism relies to a very large extent on legal theft of our data. And there's no doubt about that. But it's more than that. The immense success of platforms stems from having a capacity to manipulate behaviors, not simply to collect data on behaviors, but effectively to guide us. Every time two people are mediated through a platform, that platform does its best to manipulate their behavior in a manner which is profitable to the platform. And that has caused me to rethink capitalism in a sense, because to have a capitalist, you need to have a proletarian. It was always difficult for me to define in my head in a meaningful and helpful way what a proletarian really is. And now in my older age, the more I think about it, the more I think that the more I come to the conclusion that to be a proletarian means that you're a cog in a process of production that relies on what you do and what you think, while excluding you as a subject, as anything but its product, a cog in the machine. And it seems to me that the digital technologies, of course, digital does not mean surveillance capitalism, the same way that the steam engine did not mean capitalism, but it was an essential tool without which capitalism would not have taken root. The digital economy, and in particular, the way in which economies of scale and economies of scope allow companies like Facebook to own whole markets, whole marketplaces, not to be monopolists, but to own the market. And through this, to convert both consumers and workers into proletarians. Let me put it bluntly. Unless we use the very same technologies in order to bring those people down, not by means of regulation, because they will always be smarter at outpacing and bypassing our regulatory authorities, but effectively changing the property rights over the data and the actual companies, the servers. Unless we can do that, I think that the rest will be futile, but I think we can do it. And we can utilize their own technologies, turning them against them. So that's where my hope comes from.
Strains of optimism I'm seeing emerging in this conversation.
Hope.
Sorry. Hope. Yes, indeed, hope. But I think it's this moment of hastened contradiction. I mean, both of you are describing a system that is not necessarily now at breaking point, but is revealing itself to have these kind of fatal flaws that are going to require some kind of collective action. I mean, this $1 trillion valuation of Amazon, this to me is major cause for concern. I'm old enough to remember when having $1 million was the great marker of.
It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. This is how the stock exchange works. It would be mad to have any other kind of valuation.
And so, Shoshana, turning the question back to you, I think that it's interesting to proceed from this consensus that whatever is emerging with these platforms is something deeply ill, deeply in need of a kind of collective action. And so in your, when you look at, let's take the United States, for example, right? It's a case of severe corporate capture. We're talking about, a blob, so to speak, in DC that's not particularly amenable to these movements towards collective action. Of course, I do see positive signs, reasons for hope. But when it comes to the question of surveillance capitalism, and it comes to the course of this pandemic, for our viewers who are deeply concerned about Amazon's monopolistic position, how can we strive to empower them with a vision? Given that we're talking about a vision for the future, a vision for how they might take on these titans, these platform titans, and what to do with a phenomenon like Jeff Bezos. Where do we go from here?
Well, look, I can't stress enough sort of where I think we are in this process. So, imagine making it, through the 20th century, into the 1960s or something like that, without child labor legislation, or the right to join a trade union, or to strike, or to bargain collectively, or without institutions that oversee worker safety and working conditions and consumer safety and the safety of food, and without unemployment insurance, and so on and so forth. I mean, those are institutional forms and rights and legal frameworks that were the result of immense creativity during key decades of the 20th century. And I'm not a utopianist, and I understand that the world they produce is far from a perfect world, but it created a middle class, and it lifted many boats, and it was for a period of time until the mid 70s. There was a lot of success in the results of those creative institutions, and that's very much where I think we are now. Facing the need for that period of creativity. And so when we, drawing out that analogy, creativity then was enabled by the fact of collective mobilization. And I fully agree that that is something that we need now. And, in this idea of what is a proletariat? Well, in this digital century, there is a term, and it's called the user. It's not the consumer, and it's not the worker, it's the user, which is essentially all of us. And that has been this hugely, anonymous, undifferentiated term that has been used to describe us by them. I don't like calling them platforms. The platform is a technical term, a neutral term. They are corporations, and they are corporations built on illicit wealth. So to me, the question is, working both sides of this equation, users coming into a new form of self-consciousness. We aren't just users, we are citizens. In many cases, we are citizens of democratic societies, and the terms of the conditions of existence that we are facing, as handed to us by these information empires, are fundamentally illegitimate and intolerable. So collective action rising out of that. There is already evidence of this. Even the advertising boycott that is occurring now began in the States, is moving globally. This is not users per se, but this is the demand side. And this is a little glimpse of what can happen when we go after the incentives in their markets, when we say that it is not only undesirable, but ultimately we say it is illegal to trade in human futures, the same way that we say it is illegal to trade in human babies or in human organs. These pernicious markets with predictably pernicious results for individuals and for the aspirations of democratic citizens have been criminalized and can be criminalized again, both for the sake of democracy and for the sake of economy. So I think that there are, the people always say to me, what should I do? And this is not the kind of problem that we're going to resolve as individuals. But could we see boycotts of users? Could we see tens of millions or billions of users deciding not to use the services and products of a particular corporation, an information empire, for a month or for 6 months or for a year or forever? Could we see that? Yes, we could. I believe that is now imaginable and discussable in a way that a few years ago it would have sounded like science fiction or delirious optimism, perhaps. So I think these things are all becoming real. Just before lockdown, I spent 14 months on the road talking to large groups of users in many countries, in many cities. And in every single group, I began the conversation the same way. Why are you here? What brought you here? You could be snuggling at home. You could be out having dinner. You could be at a movie. Why are you here? And around the world, I heard the same things from every group. I heard the words, because I asked people to write them down in every event. I heard the words of freedom, control, autonomy, democracy, resistance, these kinds of words repeated over and over again. There's a wonderful sort of list that I've got of the words that everybody had in common in all these different places. That says to me that is the beginning of the user concept dissolving. Just as in the early 19th century, everybody who wasn't an aristocrat was considered a member of the lower classes, and there wasn't even a concept of the working class. Well, I think the user concept is dissolving, and out of that, this consciousness was already breeding and is now again in a position of intensification and amplification. And these new forms of collective action will be emergent. And I think we're already seeing that.
Yeah, I think honestly, this is a very beautiful place to try to bring our conversation to a close, because we as DiEM25, as Democracy in Europe movement, our goal has always been to interrogate what the meaning is and what the frontier could be for a citizenship of Europe, not of the European Union as such, but of Europe. And this book that we've now put together, that both of you have contributed to, and Yanis has wonderfully delivered an introductory section that really lays out a sense of kind of what the stakes of the book are. It's about this question, Shoshana. Are we users? What is it? How do we move away from being users towards being citizens? How do we recover the sense of citizenship away from its market orientation towards a deep social, plural sense of what European citizenship is and what it could be? So I think I'm also here in my capacity as co-editor of this book with my dear friend Rosemary, and therefore it is my obligation to plug it. And I hope you will all visit our publisher's site at ERIS Press and check out the book for yourself. It's really an incredible collection of perspectives. And what I'd like to think about is where we're going to be in 2-3 months. I mean, it's going to be a hot summer. This pandemic is escalating. It changes more quickly than ever. And I thought by way of closing, I might turn to each of you and ask a question I've never had the opportunity to ask on a session like this, which is, for a historical analogy, maybe I could pass it to each of you. What if you could pick a year where you think that this is closest to? We hear this unprecedented, but we're putting forward a vision of Europe. Past visions have been put forward as well. If you could pick a year or a circumstance, where do you think we are now? I'll start with you, Shoshana.
Well, I have a couple of candidates, but you know, in some ways, the fourth decade of the 20th century, the 30s, that was a period that began with tremendous crisis. That still at the beginning of the decade of the 1930s, it looked like it would be impossible to rein in the corporate empires, the monopoly empires of that period. And if you were going to predict the future of the 20th century from the vantage point of 1930, you would have seen a century of oligarchs and serfs. But that is not how the 20th century actually turned out, at least in many societies. So I think there's some analogy there, a sense of inevitabilism, a sense of doom, a sense of dystopia, but also a sense that this does not have to be our future. There is nothing inevitable about this. Our societies, our people have the resources for not only a rebirth, but a fertile, creative new decade. But ideally one that does not end in world war, which is, of course, always the problem when you're trying to analogize anything to the 20th century. Could there be conflict if these issues we're talking about are not resolved? Yes, absolutely. But my hope is that the third decade will be our decade to turn this around in a way that is, that really gives us a powerful new foundation to build on.
Yanni, what do you make? Does this analogy hold, or are we in 1848? Where are we?
Well, I'll offer a different date, just to add a bit of diversity to the perspectives. 1980, Spanish flu. Not just because it was a huge pandemic, much worse than today, between 50 and 100 million died, but also because it was also an end of an era. The old world, the ancien regime of sorts, the empires were crumbling at the end of the Great War. There was a great deal of fear and hope mixed. There was the beginning of a new phase of industrialized capitalism. The roaring 20s were around the corner. Financialization was at more or less the same level of development as it is now in relative terms. And we had the best of the worst in humanity. We had, anything from the wonderful developments in physics, in literature, in the beginning of cinema, and the rise of the Nazis all at once. And as Shoshana said, the one good thing about history is that it is certainly not inevitable. And we have no right to sit back and be armchair predictors and forecasters. We have, unlike, in meteorology, where all you can do is predict and find out the hard way whether your predictions are any good, your models are any good. Here we have a moral obligation, a political obligation to be actors and to trying to make this a better planet. And on this note, I'm going to end by endorsing something Shoshana said about the capacity that the new technologies give us for collective action. As DiEM25, let me just state this for the record, we're trying to make sure that we do not miss an opportunity like that presented to us by Chris Smalls a few months ago, the worker in New Jersey, I believe, in some Amazon warehouse, who went on strike complaining about protesting the unhygienic conditions in the warehouse. And from what we found out, the board of directors of Amazon spent a good hour planning his vilification. That was the moment to start a global strike action against Amazon. But I think the key, and this is what DiEM25 is planning to do, is to combine support and solidarity to workers of companies like Amazon with consumer strikes that are targeted, short, sharp, and move from one target to the other. This is how we're going to change the world.
Well, an inspiring call to action with one small amendment, which is that we do give you permission to be in your armchair and read the book that we've just delightfully put together. So, yeah, you can also read it while you're walking through a march or wherever you may be in the world. While we're here, I want to take the opportunity to thank you both. I know you are exceptionally busy people, and I'm really grateful for your time. And I'm sure our viewers are tremendously grateful for your perspective on these issues. Even if we were, arrive to a very positive, constructive set of disagreements, I think it will be a conversation I continue to think about for the rest of the year. So I hope to connect with you both very soon. Shoshana, I really appreciate your time. Yanis, always a pleasure. So have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And we'll sign off here. Take care.
Bravo. Thank you. A pleasure.